Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. It began as a strange rumor, whispered across the crowded streets of Dunsbridge, a quiet town nestled in the valley between two ancient forests. At first, no one paid attention. Ghost stories were a common pastime in a place with such a long and storied past. But soon the whispers grew louder, more insistent. People were vanishing, only they didn't stay gone. The first case was reported by an elderly man named Arthur Brandt, who lived alone at the edge of town. His neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, noticed that Arthur hadn't left his house for days. Concerned, she knocked on his door, only to be greeted by silence. She called the local authorities, fearing the worst. When they forced the door open, they found Arthur sitting in his armchair, his eyes wide with terror, his body cold as though he had died days ago. But there was no decay, no sign of physical harm. Then Arthur did something impossible. He blinked. His eyes focused on the officers, and he began to speak, though his voice was thin and hollow, as if it came from far away. "It's coming," he whispered. "It's already here." Before they could ask, these ghostly figures didn't behave like traditional spirits. They didn't haunt or terrify intentionally, but their mere presence spread something sinister, a plague that affected anyone who came too close. Those who touched or stood near the ghostly forms began showing symptoms within hours. Chills, a sense of being watched, and worst of all, a gradual fading of their physical presence. It became clear that the plague wasn't physical. It was something spiritual, something no one in Dunsbridge had ever encountered before. As panic gripped the town, theories began to surface. Some believed that the plague was the result of an ancient curse, tied to the old forest that bordered the valley. Others thought it might be the consequence of disturbing something buried beneath the earth. There had been an archaeological dig a few months earlier near the ruins of an old abbey. Whatever the cause, it was clear that the living and the dead were becoming intertwined in a way that defied natural order. The town's priest, Father Elias, proposed a desperate solution. "We must cleanse the town with a ritual," he declared. "If this is a curse, we must seek forgiveness." But the ritual, performed in the town square under a cold, moonless sky, did nothing to halt the spread of the plague. Meanwhile, a group of young researchers led by Dr. Helena Cross, a specialist in paranormal phenomena, arrived in Dunsbridge. Helena believed that the plague wasn't a curse, but a rift between the world of the living and the dead. Something had broken the barrier that separated the two realms. "We need to find the source of the rift and close it," she said. Helena and her team began investigating the recent dig near the old abbey ruins. According to local legends, the abbey had been built over a well of souls, a place where spirits gathered before moving on to the afterlife. If the dig had disturbed this ancient site, it might explain the sudden outbreak of the ghost plague. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the team encountered ghostly figures wandering aimlessly. The air grew colder with each step, and an unnatural silence blanketed the woods. At the heart of the ruins, they found what they were looking for, a large circular stone slab etched with ancient symbols. The slab had been cracked open, revealing a dark void beneath it. "This is it," Helena whispered. "The rift." Helena theorized that if they could seal the rift, the plague would stop. But it wasn't as simple as placing the stone back over the void. They needed to perform a ritual using the symbols etched on the slab, and they needed to do it before the rift widened any further. As Helena and her team prepared for the ritual, ghostly figures began to emerge from the forest, drawn to the rift. The air grew colder, and an unearthly wind howled through the trees. The team worked quickly, chanting the ancient words inscribed on the slab while placing sacred relics around the site. The ground trembled, and for a moment, it seemed as if the rift would consume everything. But as the final words of the ritual were spoken, a blinding light erupted from the void. The ghostly figures let out a collective sigh and began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light. When the light subsided, the rift was gone, and the cold that had gripped the forest disappeared. The ghost plague was over. In the days that followed, the town of Dunsbridge began to heal. Those who had been afflicted by the plague returned to normal. with no memory of their time as ghostly figures. The old abbey ruins were sealed off permanently, and a memorial was erected to honor those who had been lost. Though life in Dunsbridge returned to normal, the townsfolk never forgot the ghost plague. Some claimed that on cold, quiet nights, they could still hear faint whispers coming from the forest, a reminder of the time when the boundary between life and death had been shattered. Helena and her team left the town, their work done, but she knew that the world was full of mysteries like the one they had faced. Somewhere out there, another rift might open, and when it did, they would be ready. For now, Dunsbridge remained a place of whispered legends, where the living and the dead had once shared the same haunted breath. In the heart of an aging city stood St. Margaret's Hospital, a sprawling complex built over a century ago. Though modern wings had been added over the years, the oldest section, Ward 13, remained shrouded in mystery and dread. For decades, the ward had been the subject of hushed whispers among staff and patients alike. People spoke of strange noises, flickering lights, and an eerie, oppressive feeling that seemed to seep from its very walls. But the most terrifying tales were those of the vanished, patients who were admitted to Ward 13 and never seen again. Despite these chilling rumors, the hospital administrators had refused to close the ward, citing financial constraints. After all, St. Margaret's was always overcrowded, and they couldn't afford to lose an entire section of beds. But for those who had worked in the ward, there was no denying that something was deeply wrong. It was a stormy night in late November when nurse Claire Everson was assigned to cover the night shift in Ward 13. Claire had heard the rumors, of course, but she dismissed them as mere superstition. She had always been skeptical of the supernatural, believing that every strange occurrence had a logical explanation. Still, there was something about being alone in the dimly lit hallways of Ward 13 that sent a shiver down her spine. The ward housed 6 patients that night, all of them in for minor surgeries or recoveries. Claire made her rounds, checking vitals and ensuring that everyone was comfortable. Around midnight, as the rain pounded against the windows and the wind howled outside, Claire noticed something strange. Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man recovering from a broken leg, was missing from his bed. At first, she assumed he had gone to the restroom, but after checking and finding it empty, a sense of unease began to creep over her. She searched the nearby hallways and even checked the elevator and stairwell, but there was no sign of Mr. Thompson. When she returned to the ward, she was startled to find his bed neatly made, as if no one had ever been there. Heart pounding, Claire checked the patient log, which still listed Mr. Thompson as being present in the hospital. She tried calling his emergency contact, but the number was disconnected. When she reported the incident to the night supervisor, she was met with a dismissive wave of the hand. "Patients wander off sometimes," the supervisor said. "He'll turn up." But deep down, Claire knew something was very wrong. Determined to find answers, Claire began digging into the history of Ward 13 during her breaks. She learned that the ward had originally been part of a tuberculosis sanatorium in the early 1900s. Hundreds of patients had died there during an epidemic, and some believed that their restless spirits still haunted the halls. Claire also found records of other unexplained disappearances over the years. The most chilling part was that none of the vanished patients had ever been found. Not in the hospital, not in the city, not anywhere. It was as if they had been erased from existence. One former nurse, Edith Granger, had written a letter before retiring, claiming that she had seen shadows moving on their own and heard voices calling her name when no one else was around. "Ward 13 is not a place for the living," Edith had written. "It is a doorway." The following night, Claire was once again assigned to Ward 13. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her as she walked the dimly lit hallways. Around 2 a.m., she heard a strange, rhythmic tapping sound coming from one of the rooms. She followed the sound to room 5, where a young woman named Emily Carter was recovering from a routine appendectomy. Claire opened the door and froze. Emily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the far corner of the room. "Do you see them?" Emily whispered. "See who?" Claire asked, stepping closer. "The shadows," Emily said, her voice trembling. "They're coming for me." Before Claire could respond, the lights flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the room. The shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, as if they had come to life. Claire reached out to grab Emily's hand, but in that instant, the young woman vanished before her eyes. By now, Claire was convinced that something supernatural was at work. She confided in Dr. Michael Hensley, a physician she trusted, and together they decided to investigate further. They discovered that Ward 13 had been built over a network of underground tunnels, which had once been used to transport bodies out of the hospital during the tuberculosis epidemic. With the help of an old set of blueprints, Claire and Dr. Hensley located a sealed entrance to the tunnels in the basement of the hospital. Armed with flashlights and a sense of grim determination, they pried open the rusted door and descended into the darkness. The air in the tunnels was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange symbols etched into the stone. As they ventured deeper, they began to hear faint whispers echoing around them. The voices grew louder and more distinct until they could make out words. "Join us. Stay with us forever." At the end of the tunnel, they found a large circular chamber. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling altar surrounded by more of the strange symbols. Claire realized that this place was the source of the hauntings, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had worn thin. Claire and Dr. Hensley knew they had to do something to break the curse that bound the spirits to Ward 13. Remembering the symbols Edith Granger had mentioned in her letter, Claire traced them onto the altar with chalk, while Dr. Hensley recited a prayer he had found in an old religious text. As they completed the ritual, a deafening roar filled the chamber, and a blinding light erupted from the altar. The shadows that had haunted the ward for so long began to dissolve, and the oppressive cold lifted. When they returned to Ward 13, they found Emily and Mr. Thompson, both alive and well, lying in their beds as if nothing had happened. The patients had no memory of their disappearances, but Claire knew that the curse had finally been lifted. Ward 13 was permanently closed a week later, with the hospital citing structural issues as the official reason. Claire and Dr. Hensley never spoke publicly about what they had experienced, but those who knew them could tell that they had seen things no one else could understand. Though the ward was sealed off, some say that on quiet nights you can still hear faint whispers echoing through the hospital's halls, echoes of the departed, forever bound to the place where life and death once converged. In the remote village of Gray Hollow, nestled deep within a dense forest, life was simple and peaceful. The villagers lived off the land, their days marked by the rhythm of nature. But one summer, something strange happened. A mysterious illness began to spread, and with it came a terror that no one could have imagined. It started with a young boy named Evan, who came down with a high fever after playing near the woods. His mother, Martha, thought it was nothing more than a summer flu. She gave him herbal teas and kept him in bed. But as night fell, Evan began to scream. "They're here!" he cried, his eyes wide with fear. "They're everywhere!" Martha rushed to his side, but he pushed her away, pointing toward the corner of the room. "Don't let them touch me, please," he sobbed. Martha saw nothing but shadows dancing on the walls, cast by the flickering oil lamp. She tried to calm her son, thinking it was just a fever dream, but Evan wouldn't stop trembling. The next morning, his fever broke. But Evan was different. He wouldn't speak of what he had seen, but he refused to go near the woods, and his once bright eyes were now dull and haunted. Within days, more villagers began to fall ill. The symptoms were always the same: a high fever followed by terrifying hallucinations. Those afflicted claimed to see horrifying spirits, pale figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces lurking in every shadow. Old Father Gregory, the village's priest, tried to comfort the sick by offering prayers and blessings, but even he grew pale with fear when he heard their stories. He recalled ancient tales of a curse that had once plagued Gray Hollow long ago, a curse tied to the forest. "They say the woods are home to restless spirits," he told the village elders, "spirits that can only be seen when a person is close to death." Despite his warnings, no one knew how to stop the illness. One night, Eliza, a young woman who had contracted the fever, began to scream uncontrollably. Her husband, Thomas, rushed to her side, only to find her pointing toward the ceiling. "They're watching us," she shrieked. "They want to take us." Thomas tried to reassure her, but as he looked around the dimly lit room, he began to feel a chill in the air. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to lengthen and twist unnaturally. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a figure standing in the corner, its face obscured by darkness. But when he blinked, it was gone. The next morning, Eliza's fever had subsided, but like Evan, she was forever changed. "They're still here," she whispered to Thomas. "They're always watching." As more and more villagers succumbed to the fever, panic spread. The once thriving village became silent and fearful, with people too afraid to leave their homes after dark. Desperate for answers, the elders gathered in the church to discuss what to do. "We must find the source of this curse," said Elder Rowan, the oldest and wisest among them. "Something has awakened the spirits of the forest." Father Gregory suggested seeking the help of Agatha, an old herbalist who lived on the outskirts of the village. Some whispered that she was a witch, but others believed she knew ancient remedies and the secrets of the forest. Thomas, Martha, and Father Gregory set out to find Agatha. When they reached her small, crooked cottage, they found her tending to a garden filled with strange herbs. She listened carefully as they explained what had been happening in the village. "This is no ordinary illness," Agatha said, her voice grave. "You speak of the fever of shadows, a curse born from a broken pact." She went on to explain that long ago, the villagers had made a pact with the spirits of the forest to protect the land. But over time, the villagers had forgotten their promise, cutting down trees and disturbing sacred places. The spirits, angered by the villagers' neglect, had unleashed the fever as a warning. "There is only one way to end this," Agatha said. "You must go to the heart of the forest, to the ancient stone circle where the pact was first made. There, you must offer a gift to appease the spirits." That night, a small group of brave villagers, led by Thomas, Martha, and Father Gregory, ventured into the forest. The air grew colder and heavier as they went deeper, and the shadows seemed to follow them, whispering in a language they couldn't understand. After hours of walking, they reached the ancient stone circle, a ring of towering stones covered in moss and carved with symbols no one could read. In the center of the circle was a stone altar. Agatha had told them to offer something precious, something that symbolized life and hope. Martha stepped forward and placed a small silver locket on the altar, a locket that had belonged to her mother, a symbol of love and family. Father Gregory recited a prayer, asking for forgiveness and peace. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a gust of wind swept through the circle, and the shadows around them began to dissolve. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The villagers felt a sense of calm wash over them. When they returned to the village, they found that the fever had vanished. Those who had been sick were recovering, and the haunting visions had stopped. Though the villagers were relieved, they never forgot what had happened. They rebuilt their bond with the forest, planting new trees and treating the land with respect. Evan, Eliza, and the others who had suffered the fever slowly regained their strength, though they never spoke of what they had seen during their illness. Some believed that they had glimpsed the world beyond, a place where the spirits of the past lingered. Father Gregory recorded the events in the village's chronicles, warning future generations never to forget the pact with the forest. And though life returned to normal in Grey Hollow, the villagers always remained cautious, knowing that the shadows of the past could return if they were ever forgotten. Thus, the tale of the fever of shadows became a legend, a reminder that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than anyone could imagine. It was a tale whispered in fear by those who lived in the desolate village of Black Hollow, a curse so dreadful that even the bravest souls shuddered at its mention. The legend claimed that those afflicted by this ancient curse could never die. They would live on year after year, their bodies incapable of perishing, but their minds forever tormented by restless spirits. Long ago, Black Hollow had been a thriving settlement nestled at the edge of an ancient forest. The villagers prospered by trading with travelers who passed through the region. However, their greed grew as the years passed, and they began to desecrate sacred burial grounds hidden deep within the forest, stealing treasures buried with the dead. One night, an old woman cloaked in tattered robes appeared in the village square. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light as she pointed a gnarled finger at the gathered villagers. "You have disturbed the peace of the dead," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "For your greed, you shall bear the weight of their torment for eternity." At first, the villagers dismissed her warning as the ramblings of a madwoman. But when the old woman vanished without a trace, unease began to spread through the town. They soon discovered that anyone who had taken part in the desecration began to experience strange phenomena. Shadows moved where there should have been none. Whispering voices echoed through empty rooms. Worst of all, those afflicted found that no injury, no matter how grave, could end their suffering. One of the first victims was Harold, a blacksmith who had stolen a jeweled dagger from the forest graves. One day while working in his forge, a fire erupted, engulfing him in flames. The villagers tried to douse the fire, but by the time they succeeded, Harold should have been dead. Instead, he stood, his flesh charred but unburned, his eyes wide with terror. "They won't let me go," he whispered hoarsely. "They're here, always watching." Over the following days, Harold's mind began to unravel. He spoke of ghostly figures that surrounded him at all hours, whispering accusations of theft and betrayal. Though his body healed from the burns, his spirit seemed to decay, as if weighed down by an unseen force. Eventually, he disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. As more villagers fell victim to the curse, fear gripped Black Hollow. Those who hadn't taken part in the desecration tried to distance themselves from the cursed, but it made no difference. The spirits haunting the afflicted seemed to grow stronger, their presence more palpable, as if feeding on the fear of the living. The village elders gathered to discuss how they might lift the curse. Some believed they needed to return the stolen treasures, while others thought they should make a grand offering to appease the spirits. They sought the help of Sister Eleanor, a reclusive priestess who lived in a monastery high in the mountains. Sister Eleanor listened carefully to the villagers' plea. "The curse is not one of simple vengeance," she said. "It binds the living to the world of the dead, trapping them between life and death. To break it, you must make a journey to the heart of the forest, to the place where the barrier between the worlds is thinnest." She instructed them to craft an offering of pure gold, engraved with symbols of peace and repentance. "But beware," she warned, "the spirits will try to stop you. They do not wish to lose their grip on the living." A group of villagers, led by a young woman named Lydia, set out into the forest carrying the golden offering. Lydia's father had been one of the cursed, and she was determined to free him from his torment. As they ventured deeper into the forest, an unnatural chill set in. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air grew thick with whispers. "They're watching us," one of the villagers muttered nervously. Shadows flitted at the edges of their vision, but whenever they turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, the group huddled around a fire, but the spirits gave them no rest. Lydia dreamed of ghostly figures reaching out to her, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and anger. She woke with a start, clutching the golden offering tightly. After days of travel, they finally reached the heart of the forest, a clearing bathed in an eerie silver light. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss. Lydia stepped forward and placed the golden offering on the altar. Following Sister Eleanor's instructions, she began to recite a prayer of atonement. As she spoke, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned into wails. Ghostly figures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like dying flames. The spirits surged toward the villagers, but an unseen force held them back, as if the altar itself repelled them. "Please," Lydia cried, her voice breaking, "we seek forgiveness. Let my father and the others find peace." For a moment there was silence. Then the spirits began to fade, their anguished expressions softening. The golden offering glowed brightly before melting away, absorbed into the altar. When the villagers returned to Black Hollow, they found that the curse had been lifted. Those who had been unable to die could now pass peacefully into the afterlife. Lydia's father, once a hollow shell of a man, smiled for the first time in years before closing his eyes for the final time. Though the curse was broken, the villagers never forgot the lesson they had learned. They rebuilt their village with respect for the forest and its dead, ensuring that no sacred ground was ever disturbed again. Years later, travelers passing through Black Hollow would hear tales of the curse that left its victims unable to die, but eternally haunted. They would hear of Lydia's bravery and the spirits that once roamed the forest. And some would claim that on quiet nights you could still hear faint whispers in the woods, remnants of the spirits who once sought vengeance, but had finally found peace. In the small town of Willow's End, strange tales often circled among the townsfolk. Most were about eerie forests, cursed relics, or haunted buildings. But none of these stories were as peculiar or as chilling as the tale of Eleanor Blake, a woman haunted by a ghost that only appeared in mirrors. It all started one cold winter evening when Eleanor moved into the old Ashcroft Manor, a large, creaky house she had inherited from her late aunt. The house was filled with antique furniture, dusty bookshelves, and more mirrors than Eleanor cared to count. Her aunt had always been eccentric, collecting mirrors of all shapes and sizes, placing them in nearly every room. Some were ornate with gilded frames, while others were simple and cracked with age. At first, Eleanor thought nothing of the mirrors. They were just relics of her aunt's strange taste. But on her second night in the house, something happened that she couldn't explain. As she stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her hair, she noticed movement behind her reflection. A dark figure flickered in the corner of the glass, a pale woman with hollow eyes and long tangled hair. Startled, Eleanor spun around, but the room behind her was empty. She turned back to the mirror, heart pounding, and saw nothing unusual. Thinking it was a trick of the dim lighting, she dismissed it and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily that night. Over the next few days, Eleanor began to notice more odd occurrences. Whenever she glanced at a mirror, she caught fleeting glimpses of the ghostly woman. The figure never moved, never spoke, just stood there, staring with a vacant expression. Each time, the sight chilled Eleanor to her core. But when she turned away from the mirror, there was never anyone there. One afternoon, Eleanor invited her friend Laura over, hoping for some company to ease her growing unease. As they sipped tea in the living room, Laura noticed the large mirror hanging above the fireplace. "This place feels off," Laura said, frowning as she stared at her reflection. "And you have way too many mirrors, Elle." Eleanor forced a laugh. "Tell me about it. My aunt was obsessed with them." She hesitated before adding, "Do you see anything strange in them?" Laura gave her a puzzled look. "Strange? Like what?" "Never mind," Eleanor muttered, deciding it was best not to mention the ghost. She didn't want to sound crazy. That night, Eleanor woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like someone murmuring just outside her door. She sat up, her heart racing, and listened closely. The whispers seemed to be coming from her bedroom mirror. Swallowing her fear, she approached it slowly. As she drew near, the air grew colder. Her breath fogged the glass, and the whispering grew louder. Suddenly, the ghostly woman appeared in the mirror, closer than ever before. This time, she moved. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped. "Help!" Eleanor stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair. She turned to the door, but the room was silent once more. When she looked back at the mirror, the ghost was gone. Desperate for an explanation, Eleanor visited the local historian, Mr. Whitaker, the next morning. The old man had lived in Willow's End his entire life and knew all the town's dark secrets. "Ashcroft Manor, you say?" Mr. Whitaker mused, adjusting his glasses. "That house has quite the history. Your aunt wasn't the first peculiar owner." He went on to tell Eleanor about Margaret Ashcroft, the original owner of the manor. Margaret had been rumored to practice dark rituals, using mirrors as portals to communicate with the dead. After her mysterious death, several residents claimed to see her spirit in mirrors throughout the house. "Do you think she's haunting me?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "It's possible. Spirits tethered to mirrors are often trapped between worlds, unable to move on. If she's appearing to you, she might be seeking release." Determined to end the haunting, Eleanor decided to confront the ghost. That night, she lit candles around the largest mirror in the house, the ornate one in the dining room. She sat before it, staring into her own reflection, waiting for the ghost to appear. Hours passed, and just as Eleanor was about to give up, the air grew cold once more. The candle flames flickered wildly, and the ghostly figure emerged in the mirror, her hollow eyes locking with Eleanor's. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. The ghost's expression softened. "Help. Me," she whispered again. This time, Eleanor noticed tears in the spirit's eyes. "How?" Eleanor pressed. "How can I help you?" The ghost raised a translucent hand and pointed toward the attic. Before Eleanor could ask anything further, the figure faded away. Eleanor climbed to the attic, the old wooden stairs creaking beneath her feet. The attic was filled with dust-covered boxes and forgotten furniture. In the corner, she found a small chest. Inside it was a cracked hand mirror, its frame decorated with strange runes. As soon as Eleanor touched the mirror, A rush of cold air swept through the attic, and the ghost appeared before her, not in the mirror, but in the room itself. This mirror, Eleanor realized aloud. It's what's keeping you here. The ghost nodded silently. Summoning her courage, Eleanor took the hand mirror and carried it outside. With a deep breath, she hurled it onto the ground, shattering it into countless pieces. A gust of wind swirled around her, carrying with it a soft whisper of gratitude. From that day forward, Eleanor never saw the ghost again. The house felt warmer, less oppressive, as if a great weight had been lifted. She removed most of the mirrors, keeping only a few for practical purposes. Though the haunting was over, she never forgot the ghostly woman who had sought her help. The townsfolk noticed a change in Eleanor. She seemed calmer, more at ease. When asked about it, she would simply smile and say, "Sometimes even the dead just need someone to listen." Thus ended the haunting of Ashcroft Manor, but the story lived on in Willow's End, a tale of mirrors, ghosts, and the bravery of a woman who dared to face the spirit lurking within the glass. In a small, forgotten village nestled deep within a dense forest, there was an old, decrepit shop run by a reclusive craftsman named Marcellus Gray. The villagers rarely visited him, for his wares were said to be cursed. Among his collection of strange trinkets and antiques, there was one object that stood out, a mask unlike any other. Dark and intricately carved with runes and grotesque patterns, the mask seemed to possess a life of its own. Rumors whispered that it revealed the darkest fears of anyone who dared wear it. The mask had a sinister reputation that spanned generations. It was said to have once belonged to a nobleman who wished to conquer his fear of death. He sought Marcellus's help, believing that if he faced his fears head-on, he would become invincible. But when he placed the mask upon his face, it did not merely show him death, it dragged him into a nightmare from which he never awoke. His body remained lifeless, though his eyes were wide open in perpetual terror. Over the years, many others tried to test their courage by wearing the mask, but none emerged unscathed. Some were driven mad, others disappeared entirely, and a few were found lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable horror. Centuries later, the masked legend had faded into obscurity, known only to a few elders in the village. One such elder, Grandmother Eliza, often told tales of the mask to her granddaughter, Lena, a curious and adventurous young woman who had always been drawn to the mysterious. Despite the warnings, Lena felt a strange pull toward the legend. She had long struggled with recurring nightmares and unresolved fears from her past, fears she wished to conquer. One cold autumn evening, after hearing her grandmother's stories once again, Lena decided she could no longer resist the lure of the mask. She believed that if she could confront her fears, she might finally be free of them. "I have to see it for myself," she whispered to herself as she slipped on her cloak and headed out into the night. The path to Marcellus's old shop was overgrown and twisted, lined with gnarled trees that seemed to whisper as the wind passed through their branches. Though the shop had been abandoned for decades, the door creaked open easily when Lena pushed against it. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and shadows danced across the walls as her lantern flickered. She searched the shelves, her heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. At last she found it, resting atop a pedestal in the center of the room. The mask was as eerie as her grandmother had described, its dark surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Lena hesitated, her hand hovering over the mask. She could feel a strange energy emanating from it, as though it were aware of her presence. Taking a deep breath, she grasped the mask and lifted it to her face. The moment the mask touched her skin, the world around Lena changed. The shop vanished, replaced by a dark, endless void. Out of the void emerged a figure cloaked in shadows, its face shifting constantly to reflect Lena's deepest fears. Her mother's lifeless eyes a towering inferno, and the cold, empty expanse of loneliness she had known as a child. The figure spoke in a voice that echoed like 1,000 whispers. "You cannot hide from your fear, Lena. It has always been with you." Lena tried to tear the mask from her face, but it would not budge. Panic rose in her chest as the figure advanced, its shadowy tendrils reaching out to engulf her. She felt the weight of her fears pressing down on her, threatening to crush her entirely. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, I will not be ruled by fear." Summoning all her strength, Lena focused on the figure, refusing to look away. She faced each fear as it appeared: the fear of losing loved ones, the fear of failure, and the fear of being forgotten. Slowly, she began to realize that these fears, though powerful, could not define her. The shadows faltered, retreating slightly. The figure hissed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You are stronger than you believe," Lena said, her voice steady now. "I may have fears, but I am more than them." With those words, the mask began to crack. Light poured through the fractures, illuminating the void. The figure let out a final, anguished cry before shattering into countless fragments. The mask fell from Lena's face, and she found herself back in the old shop, gasping for breath. The shop was no longer dark and foreboding. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the air felt lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted. Lena looked down at the mask, now reduced to nothing more than a pile of dust. Word spread quickly through the village about Lena's encounter with the haunted mask. Some were skeptical, while others believed she had truly broken the curse that had plagued the town for centuries. Grandmother Eliza, however, knew the truth. "You've done something no one else could," she told Lena, pride shining in her eyes. "You faced your fears and emerged victorious. That is a strength few possess." Lena smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Though she still carried her fears, they no longer controlled her. She had learned that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to confront it head-on. And so the tale of the haunted mask came to an end, not as a story of terror, but as a story of triumph. Yet in the shadows of the forest, there were whispers of other cursed objects waiting to be discovered, each with its own dark legend and a lesson to be learned. But that was a tale for another time. In the quiet town of Grayfield, nestled between sprawling fields and thick forests, there was an unassuming house at the end of a lonely cul-de-sac. To passers-by, it looked like any other home: worn shutters, a creaky porch, and a garden that had long been overtaken by weeds. But the locals knew better. They whispered of strange happenings, of people who entered that house and left as hollow shells of their former selves, their minds broken and scattered. The house, they said, was haunted by a ghost unlike any other, a spirit that didn't merely terrify its victims, but slowly unraveled their sense of reality by manipulating their memories. Jacob Finn, a writer seeking solitude to finish his long-overdue novel, arrived in Grayfield one crisp autumn afternoon. He had heard nothing of the town's dark rumors or the house's sinister reputation. All he knew was that it was cheap, isolated, and exactly what he needed to escape the distractions of city life. "Perfect," Jacob muttered to himself as he unpacked his things, oblivious to the wary glances from his new neighbors. That night, as he settled into bed, he felt an odd chill despite the warmth of the fireplace. He dismissed it as nothing more than the unfamiliarity of a new place. But as he drifted off to sleep, he thought he heard something: whispers, faint and indistinct, like a distant conversation just out of reach. Over the next few days, Jacob threw himself into his writing. He was making progress for the first time in months, and he attributed it to the quiet seclusion of the house. Yet strange things began to happen. He would find objects move from their places: his coffee mug on the windowsill instead of the desk, his notebook open to pages he didn't remember writing. Then came the memories. One morning, Jacob awoke with a vivid recollection of a childhood trip to the beach with his parents. He could see the bright sun, hear the crashing waves, and feel the gritty sand beneath his fingers. But something was wrong. His mother's face was a blur, her voice a distorted echo. "That never happened," Jacob muttered, shaking his head. He had never been to the beach as a child. His family couldn't afford such trips. Yet the memory felt so real, so tangible, that it left him questioning himself. As the days turned into weeks, the false memories grew more frequent and more disturbing. Jacob recalled conversations with friends he had never met, birthdays that had never occurred, and arguments that seemed to have no basis in reality. Each memory was vivid and detailed, yet subtly wrong: faces blurred, voices warped, and events twisted just enough to leave him doubting his own mind. The whispers grew louder at night, filling the house with an eerie presence. Jacob began to hear them during the day as well, soft murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. "Who's there?" he called out one afternoon, his voice trembling with fear and frustration. But there was no response. only silence. That evening, as he sat at his desk trying to write, he caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror on the wall. A shadowy figure stood behind him, its form shifting like smoke. Jacob spun around, but the room was empty. Jacob's grip on reality began to slip. He found himself unable to distinguish between real memories and the ones planted by the ghost. His manuscript, once coherent and promising, became a jumbled mess of half-formed ideas and nonsensical ramblings. He would reread his own words and find phrases he didn't remember writing, entire paragraphs filled with cryptic messages. Remember what you forgot. They are not your memories. You will lose yourself. Desperate for answers, Jacob turned to the town's archives. He learned that the house had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Hale, who had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. According to legend, she had been driven mad by the townsfolk's relentless persecution, and in her final moments, she cursed the house to trap anyone who dared live there. It was said that her ghost lingered, feeding on the memories of its victims, leaving them broken and lost. Determined to break free, Jacob devised a plan. He would confront the ghost, force it to reveal itself, and demand the return of his memories. That night, armed with nothing more than a flickering lantern and his own dwindling sanity, he sat in the center of the living room and called out to the spirit. "I know you're here," he said, his voice echoing through the empty house. "Show yourself." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with an oppressive presence. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling Jacob's mind with a cacophony of voices. A figure materialized before him, its form shifting and indistinct, like a living shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, filled with an ancient malice. "Why do you torment me?" Jacob demanded, his voice shaking but resolute. "What do you want?" The ghost did not speak, but Jacob felt its intent, an overwhelming desire to consume him, to erase his identity and leave him a hollow shell. But Jacob was not ready to give in. "You can't have my memories," he said, clutching the lantern tightly. "They are mine." With a surge of willpower, Jacob focused on his most precious memories. His parents' faces, his childhood home, the friends who had shaped his life. He clung to them, refusing to let the ghost twist or take them away. The spirit recoiled, its form flickering as if in pain. The whispers grew frantic, then faded altogether. The oppressive presence lifted, and the room returned to normal. The next morning, Jacob awoke feeling lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from his mind. The memories planted by the ghost had faded, leaving only faint echoes that no longer held power over him. He finished his manuscript within a week, a story inspired by his ordeal, a tale of confronting one's fears and reclaiming one's sense of self. Jacob left Grayfield soon after, never looking back. The house remained empty, its legend growing darker with each passing year. But Jacob knew the truth, that while the ghost of Margaret Hale had been driven back, her curse remained, waiting for the next unwary soul to enter her domain. And so the house at the end of the lonely cul-de-sac continued to stand, a silent sentinel of forgotten memories and whispered fears.